Hi, I'm Timothy. Today, I'm exploring airport stories where the final destination came much sooner than expected. Departures that became permanent and shocked everyone. From a ground worker disconnecting a hose until it turned against her, to a bookkeeper chasing a runaway suitcase straight into the path of something she never saw coming. It was the evening of September 18th, 2016, and Phoenix, Arizona was finishing off another dry, windy, late summer day. A steady wind was sweeping low across the ramp, the kind that pushes everything sideways instead of letting it rise and clear out. The airport had been dealing with delays for hours, and ground crews were stretched thin trying to turn aircraft around fast enough to keep the schedule from falling apart completely. Angela Trott was 34 years old, and she had spent nearly 11 years working ground operations for a private contractor that handled aircraft refueling. People who worked alongside her described her the same way over and over: fast, efficient, almost impossible to slow down once she got moving. To me, that kind of reputation can go both ways in a job like that. The people known for moving fast are often the same ones who stop paying attention to the little moments where they should slow down and check things first. Earlier in her shift, the grounding clamp on her equipment had apparently been slipping loose during connections. Angela mentioned the issue to another crew member and noted that the clamp wasn't holding tension correctly, but with multiple delayed aircraft stacking up on the ramp, the equipment was never fully pulled from service for replacement. That clamp was supposed to safely drain static electricity between the truck, hose, and aircraft. Instead of shutting everything down until maintenance could properly inspect the setup, fueling operations continued while the connection remained unreliable. That evening, she was assigned to refuel a narrow-body passenger jet at one of the busier gates, with luggage crews crossing behind her truck constantly. The wind was strong enough that any vapor escaping her equipment wasn't drifting upward. It was being pushed low across the concrete, hugging the ground around her boots. Investigators later determined that a worn hose coupling near the nozzle had been releasing a fine atomized spray during the entire refueling. The kind of mist you might not notice if you were focused on finishing a turnaround in a hurry. Angela disconnected the hose before fully resecuring the vapor cap. As she stepped between the truck and the wing, a sudden flash burst out from the fueling point. Witnesses described a fast-moving wave of flame rolling outward across the concrete before catching the suspended fuel mist around the connection. Her reflective vest and gloves caught fire almost immediately, and the flames spread up both arms and across her upper torso within seconds. She stumbled backward, dropping the nozzle as burning fuel splashed onto her pants and boots. The hose, still pressurized, disconnected and whipped violently across the ramp, spraying burning fuel in a wide arc around the truck. A baggage handler nearby tried to reach her with a handheld extinguisher from several yards away, but by then she had already collapsed beside the truck, flames still burning around her lower body and neck. Thick smoke climbed above the gate area as passengers seated inside nearby aircraft began turning their phones toward the windows. Responders reached her within minutes and blanketed the ramp with foam suppressant. She was rushed to a nearby trauma center, but the damage was too severe. The official cause of death was a combination of catastrophic thermal burns across most of her body and acute inhalation injury to her airway from breathing in superheated gases during the initial flash fire. The investigation ruled the death accidental and identified the ignition source as static discharge near the damaged fueling connection, a discharge the faulty grounding clamp should have prevented. The worn clamp Angela had already brought attention to earlier in the shift was pulled from the truck and logged as physical evidence. In my opinion, if she had stopped and paid closer attention to that damaged clamp instead of pushing through the turnaround, there's a very real chance she would have gone home that day. A lot of you watching probably trust that the people working around fuel know exactly what they're doing. But the next story I came across showed me that even the people we expect to be the safest in the room can end up being the ones in the most danger. It was April 7th, 2017 in Atlanta, Georgia, and the terminal was already humming with that kind of midday energy you only get in packed airports before a long holiday stretch. Inside, everything felt tense. Long lines at ticket counters, crowds shuffling toward TSA, and officers posted at every entrance. There were teenagers dancing near the food court, business travelers hunched over their laptops, and a steady, anxious undercurrent that I've come to recognize as the sound of people waiting out flight delays. In the middle of that restless crowd was Christopher Braun, age 41, except he wasn't there to catch a flight like everyone else. His situation was desperate. He'd been on the run for weeks, skipping a court date that could have sent him to prison on serious robbery charges. I think when people are trying to escape something terrifying, they stop thinking clearly. To me, panic takes over so fast that normal choices don't even feel normal anymore. Christopher's decisions in those last hours were a mix of muddled caution and barely contained anxiety. He never stayed in one spot too long. He was always scanning for uniforms, sweating through his clothes as he hung back near the food court. Unbeknownst to him, airport police were already searching for someone just like him after they'd gotten a tip earlier that day. Instead of immediately confronting him in the middle of the crowd, officers reportedly kept their distance at first, watching his movements from multiple positions around the concourse while additional units quietly moved closer. Witnesses later described officers near the escalators, outside a souvenir shop, and close to the terminal corridor leading towards security checkpoints. The idea seemed to be containment, preventing him from slipping deeper into the airport or reaching another exit without triggering panic inside the packed food court. When officers finally moved toward him, it happened fast and from more than one direction. One officer approached from near the seating area while another closed in from the corridor beside the restaurants, loudly identifying themselves as police. Several travelers initially thought it was just another airport disturbance until Christopher suddenly reached into his waistband and pulled a compact handgun. The first shot shattered a glass storefront beside the food court entrance, scattering a group waiting for their food. Another round slammed into a support column near the corridor leading back toward the main terminal walkway. Travelers ducked for cover wherever they could, behind kiosks, between chairs, under tables. The scene broke open in seconds. Officers shouted commands, more shots rang out, and people bolted in every direction. The concourse echoed with a quick, overlapping panic, rolling luggage abandoned on the polished floor. Christopher tried to retreat away from the officers by cutting along the outer edge of the seating area toward the terminal windows, firing behind him as he moved. Officers used the overturned seating rows and concrete support columns as cover while following at a distance instead of rushing directly into the open walkway. During the exchange, Christopher was struck in the side and lost his footing near a row of connected chairs positioned against the windows overlooking the tarmac. Responders were on him within moments. The exchange lasted less than a minute in total, but by the time medics reached his body, it was clear there was nothing they could do. Later, officers recovered a handgun beside him, and nearly every angle of the shooting had been recorded by travelers already filming the chaos erupting through the concourse. No bystanders were hit, but the scene was sealed off for hours afterward while investigators worked and abandoned bags were cleared from the floor. I saw some of those videos online, a moment of chaos, confusion, and fear that must have felt like it was never going to end for anyone who was actually there. The official report later confirmed that Christopher Braun died from multiple gunshot wounds after actively engaging with police. Officers were cleared of any wrongdoing, and the event was ruled a justified use of force during a direct threat. When I think about his story now, I keep coming back to the same thought: if he had just given up instead of fighting, he probably would have survived. For me, the next story raises a totally different set of questions about how quickly a single frustrated action can spiral, even when nobody intends for things to go wrong. Sometimes it really is just one stray minute that separates a mistake from a tragedy. It was July 2nd, 2015 in Denver, Colorado, and the evening had been one of those messy summer nights where the weather kept turning on travelers without warning. A line of thunderstorms had rolled across the area earlier, soaking the runways and pushing departures back hour by hour. By the time things settled, the terminal was overflowing with frustrated passengers, and outside on the ramp, the concrete was still slick with rain. Crews were rushing to catch up on a backlog of delayed flights, and the wet pavement made every movement out there more dangerous than usual. Herzon's skiff was 29 years old, returning home after a weekend trip with friends to see a concert. He worked overnight shifts at a warehouse, the kind of job that puts you on your feet for 10 or 12 hours at a stretch, and people who knew him described him as energetic, impulsive, and the type who didn't always think 2 steps ahead, especially when he'd been drinking. By the time he reached the airport that night, witnesses said he was visibly intoxicated, loud, and frustrated. Looking back, I honestly think someone should have stepped in earlier. If I saw somebody that intoxicated and acting reckless, I'd report it immediately. But that night, nobody seemed to take it seriously. His flight had been pushed deeper into the night, and he ended up missing his boarding call by only a few minutes. Gate staff later described how he argued, paced, and refused to accept that the door was closed. Instead of staying near the rebooking counter, he wandered off down a hallway near a maintenance corridor. That hallway is where things shifted. During the storm delays, employees had been moving supplies in and out, and a side emergency exit had been propped open while crews worked. Herzon slipped out through that unsecured door. He stepped onto an active section of the airport ramp, wearing a bright yellow reflective hoodie from his warehouse job, which, ironically, is part of why nobody immediately stopped him. Several ramp workers later said they assumed he was a co-worker walking somewhere he shouldn't. Passengers seated near the windows of nearby aircraft noticed him almost right away, pointing him out and waving towards staff. He was roughly 100 yards from the nearest crew when workers started yelling for him to stop. He didn't. Whether he couldn't hear them over the engines or just ignored them isn't something anyone can say for sure. What's known is what happened next. Herzon broke into a run across an active service lane just as a baggage tug convoy was moving through. The driver of the lead tug, traveling between 15 and 20 miles per hour, hit the brakes the moment Herzon appeared in front of him. On dry pavement, that might have been enough. On wet concrete, it wasn't close. The tug struck him on the side and threw him sideways, and the trailer carts behind it didn't have time to stop either. One wheel of the second cart rolled directly over his upper body before the convoy finally came to a halt. Workers at the scene described hearing the impact before they fully understood what had happened. Loose luggage spilled across the wet pavement, and the convoy sat awkwardly stopped on the lane while crews ran toward him. Passengers watching from a nearby aircraft saw the whole thing unfold. Responders reached him within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. The official report confirmed Herzon's skiff died from catastrophic crushing injuries to the chest and skull, which were instantly fatal. Authorities reviewed the surveillance footage, tested and cleared the tug driver, and ruled the death an accidental case of trespassing onto an active airport operations area. The propped open emergency exit became a major focus afterward, and the airport later added secondary alarms to several restricted access doors. My take from this story is pretty simple. If you're going to drink, you need to know your limit. The moment you lose control of yourself, one bad decision can turn into something permanent. The next case completely flipped that idea for me, because the people in this one weren't anywhere near the runway. They were standing inside, waiting for their bags, and the threat came from somewhere none of them thought to look. It was January 11th, 2018, in Newark, New Jersey, and the region had just spent nearly 2 days getting hammered by a winter storm. Heavy rain, wind, freezing temperatures, the kind of weather that turns even short trips into long, miserable days. Inside the airport, the baggage claim area was packed wall to wall with people coming off delayed flights, all of them tired, damp, and impatient. Water had been leaking through portions of the ceiling for hours, and maintenance crews had set out buckets in a few spots, redirecting passengers around the wet patches on the floor. A few travelers had already pulled out their phones to record the dripping ceiling. Nicole Scraw was 46 years old, and she fit into that crowd the way a lot of working travelers do. Quiet, organized, on her own. She worked as a travel nurse. That night, she was just trying to get home after a temporary assignment, standing near a support column in baggage claim while talking to her sister on speakerphone. What most people in that terminal didn't realize was that the ceiling above them had been quietly failing for hours. Several travelers had already mentioned hearing creaking sounds overhead. Investigators later determined that water from the storm had been pooling above the ceiling grid, soaking into the framework and adding weight to suspended ductwork that wasn't designed to hold it. Maintenance had treated the leaking as a cosmetic issue, not a structural one. By the time Nicole walked in, the support hardware above her was already on borrowed time. A loud popping sound rolled through the terminal first, sharp enough that several people turned their heads. A second later, a connected section of ceiling tore loose. Heavy, suspended ductwork, lighting fixtures, and metal framing dropped roughly 15 feet straight down onto the crowd. Nicole was standing directly underneath one of the largest duct sections when the supports gave out. The falling structure caught her across the shoulders and head, pinning her beneath twisted framework and broken panels. Dust, insulation, and water burst outward across the floor. The collapse didn't stop with the first drop. Smaller fragments of metal kept falling for several seconds, while the lights in that section flickered. Travelers ran in every direction, some toward the exits, others toward the debris, because there were people clearly trapped underneath. A few bystanders tried to lift portions of the wreckage by hand, but the duct sections were far too heavy. Witnesses later described the sound of metal supports crashing across the floor, followed by alarms and people shouting for help. Blood became visible beneath sections of the broken framework almost immediately. I think about how many times I've stood in places like that without ever thinking something could suddenly go wrong. It reminds me how fragile life really is, because none of us know when an ordinary day could be our last. Responders arrived within minutes, but freeing Nicole took much longer. Crews needed lifting equipment and cutting tools to remove the heavy ductwork pinning her. By the time they reached her, there was nothing they could do. The official report confirmed she died at the scene from massive blunt force trauma to the head and upper spine caused by the falling duct assembly. Several others were treated for cuts and lighter injuries, but Nicole was the only fatality. The airport closed that section of baggage claim for days while crews inspected the rest of the older terminal areas. Nicole's family later filed a wrongful death claim against the airport authority, which was eventually settled privately after investigators found the storm-related ceiling damage should have been addressed earlier. I kept thinking of the possibility that if Nicole had been standing just a few steps away or moved a little earlier, she probably would have walked away completely fine. Now, ceilings, fuel, ramps, those are all things you'd expect to be dangerous if you stop to think about them. But the next case I came across surprised me because the equipment involved was something almost every traveler interacts with personally and never thinks twice about until it's far too late. It was November 3rd, 2015 in Chicago, Illinois, and the city was already deep into one of those bitterly cold nights that come in early before winter is technically supposed to start. Wind chills had dropped below 20 degrees, and an incoming snow front was pushing crews on the cargo side of the airport to move faster than they normally would. The ramp was lit by harsh overhead floodlights, and steam rose off the metal surfaces of every vehicle moving through the freight area. It was the kind of shift where everyone just wanted to finish loading and get back inside before the weather turned worse. Danica Klain was 38 years old and had spent close to 14 years working overnight cargo loading shifts. She specialized in oversized freight, the heavy, awkward shipments that most handlers preferred to avoid. And she had built a reputation for being fast, reliable, and unbothered by the conditions other people complained about. Coworkers described her as the type who would climb into a cargo bay herself rather than wait for someone to bring over the right equipment, especially when she was trying to keep a flight on schedule. Based on her coworkers, I can easily see what kind of worker she was: someone who solved problems with her hands, even when the smarter move was to step back and let the machine do its job. That night, the aircraft she was loading had been giving the crew small problems all shift. The cargo door had been sticking intermittently, and a mechanic had come out earlier to look at the hydraulics. According to later interviews, the mechanic believed the issue had either been resolved after a pressure reset or was minor enough to monitor for the remainder of the shift, which was why the aircraft was cleared to continue operating. The plane was allowed to keep flying, but the door's behavior didn't fully settle. Coworkers later said the support strut sounded uneven each time it opened. With the snow front coming in and freight still needing to be repositioned inside, Danica decided to climb into the lower cargo bay alone to manually shift a jammed pallet. Another handler stayed outside, operating the controls from the loading platform. Investigators believe the cargo door's uplock system, the mechanism that's supposed to hold the door securely in the open position, hadn't fully engaged after one of the earlier reopenings during her shift. From the outside, it looked locked. It wasn't. While Danica was crouched directly underneath the raised door, adjusting the freight container in front of her, the hydraulic pressure holding the door in place suddenly failed. The door dropped without warning. There was a loud, sharp, metallic bang, loud enough that workers across the ramp turned toward the sound, followed by shouting from the loading platform. The full weight of the door came down across her upper back, neck, and head, pinning her against the cargo bay floor almost instantly. She didn't have time to move, and at that angle, even if she'd seen it coming, there wasn't anywhere to go. A coworker tried the emergency controls from outside, but the door wouldn't lift. Another handler crawled underneath the aircraft, looking for a secondary release. Blood began spreading outward from beneath the edge of the door while crews scrambled for help. Responders arrived within minutes, but they needed portable hydraulic lifting equipment to raise the door enough to free her. By that point, she was already gone. The official report confirmed Danica Klein died from catastrophic crushing injuries to the skull, chest, and cervical spine, all of which were instantly fatal. The aircraft was pulled from service while investigators inspected the hydraulic locking and uplock systems, and similar loading equipment across the airport was temporarily suspended for safety review. Co-workers were re-interviewed, and their statements about the door's earlier issues became central to the findings. If you would ask me, the worst part in this story is knowing that the equipment should have been taken out long before that night, and nobody bothered to do it. If you've been following along, every case so far has involved something heavy: vehicles, ceilings, machinery. But the next one shifts that completely, because the danger came from something small, moving at a speed nobody considered fast enough to hurt anyone in a part of the airport every single traveler passes through. It was August 22, 2017 in Orlando, Florida, and the airport was deep into one of its busiest stretches of the year. Summer vacation traffic had filled the terminal to capacity. The line itself moved in stops and starts, partly because one of the carry-on conveyor systems had been restarting intermittently after maintenance work earlier in the day. Helen Drunt was 62 years old, a retired teacher traveling with her daughter and grandson on what was supposed to be their first real family trip together in years. People who knew her described her as warm, talkative, and a chronic overpacker, the kind of grandmother who carried multiple tote bags full of snacks, books, and small gifts rather than checking a single suitcase. That habit followed her into the security line that day, where she was juggling several bags at once, including a tote with a long, loose scarf hanging from one of the handles. The conveyor she was using was the same line that had been giving staff problems all day. Officers kept reminding people not to reach into the moving belt area once their bins entered the scanner tunnel, but in a packed checkpoint with delayed travelers and frustrated families, those instructions tend to blur into background noise. Helen's tote tipped sideways as it entered the scanner, and the loose scarf hanging from the handle slipped down into the gap between the belt and the roller assembly. She leaned forward to grab the bag back herself rather than wait for someone to stop the line. That single decision is what changed everything. As she pulled the tote toward her, the conveyor caught the fabric and tightened it sharply around her neck and shoulder. Instead of instantly yanking her fully into the machine, the tension pulled her off balance and dragged her upper body hard against the scanner entrance. The side of her head struck the metal edge of the tunnel as she twisted awkwardly, trying to free herself. Witnesses in line behind her later described hearing a single cry as she fell partially across the conveyor housing, with the scarf continuing to tighten against her throat and chest. The belt kept moving for several more seconds. Travelers screamed. A nearby officer hit an emergency stop switch mounted along the side of the checkpoint lane. But even in those few seconds, the scarf had already wrapped deeper into the roller mechanism, pinning her awkwardly against the edge of the conveyor. Bins began stacking up behind her in a slow, awful pileup. A few passengers tried pulling the fabric loose manually, but the scarf had twisted tightly into the moving components. By the time the belt stopped, she was unconscious and bleeding from the head injury she suffered during the fall against the scanner frame. This feels like one of those moments when I feel helpless. She was older, carrying too much at once, and trying to manage it all alone. If someone had stepped in to help her earlier, she probably would have made it through safely. Responders arrived quickly because of how many officers were already at the checkpoint, but freeing her took several minutes. The official report later confirmed Helen Drunt died from a combination of severe blunt force head trauma, cervical spine injuries, and airway compression caused by the scarf during the entrapment. Her case made me realize how fast something as harmless as a scarf can turn deadly around moving equipment. Most people never think about that risk until something like this happens. The next case takes that idea even further, because it didn't start with failed equipment or one bad decision. It started with a rumor, and by the time people realized the threat wasn't real, the panic had already caused irreversible damage. It was May 29, 2018, in Las Vegas, Nevada, and the airport was packed for the start of a long holiday weekend. Evening departures had been backing up for hours, and by the time most travelers reached their gates, the concourses were so full that people were sitting on the floor against the walls. Phones were already out everywhere, mostly aimed at the departure boards or at frustrated travelers arguing with gate staff. It was one of those nights where the smallest disruption was going to spread fast through the building. Lyra Vax was 58, a bookkeeper for several small casinos who only flew a few times a year and hated crowded, unfamiliar airports. She refused to check luggage, always carrying multiple bags she kept within arm's reach, which often made her the slowest person in any group. Family said she'd been anxious about the trip for weeks, spending the night before reorganizing her bags and triple-checking everything from her boarding pass to her essentials. Earlier that evening, an unattended backpack had been spotted near a charging station at one of the busy gates. Cables were partially hanging out of it, and one passenger nearby got loud about how the bag looked suspicious, loud enough that the panic spread before any officer had even reached the area. I keep wondering how most of us would react in that situation, because if I saw a bag like that sitting unattended in a crowded airport, I'd probably report it too, instead of ignoring it. People started moving toward the exits in clusters, and overlapping evacuation rumors quickly turned into a real, uncontrolled rush through the concourse. At nearly the same time, airport staff had briefly opened a nearby service gate to move a wheelchair passenger and a maintenance cart away from the growing congestion near the terminal doors. In the confusion, and with employees suddenly focused on calming passengers inside the concourse, the gate was left unsecured for several minutes. Once a few frightened travelers pushed through it, dozens of others immediately followed behind them. A service gate that had been left open during the confusion gave the crowd direct access to an outdoor lane normally reserved for shuttle buses moving between parking areas and other terminals. Lyra got swept up in that crowd. Witnesses later said she stayed near the back of the group, struggling to keep up while dragging 2 rolling suitcases through a pair of doors she probably wasn't supposed to be using. Outside, the shuttle lane was still active. Buses had not been stopped because no official evacuation order had actually been issued. The panic was being driven entirely by passengers themselves, fueled by people on the inside texting friends and posting clips that made the situation look far worse than it really was. By the time Lyra reached the curb, the crowd around her was already pushing forward into the roadway without checking for traffic. What happened next came down to a few seconds. Lyra stepped into the active roadway, lost her grip on one of her suitcases, and bent down to grab the handle as a shuttle bus approached. The driver hit the horn and braked hard, but the front corner of the bus still struck her shoulder and knocked her under the vehicle. One of the front wheels rolled across her torso before the bus came to a complete stop. Witnesses described luggage bursting open beside the lane and several travelers screaming at the driver to stop, even though he already had. Responders arrived within minutes and used emergency lifting airbags to raise one side of the bus enough to reach her. The official report later confirmed Lyra Vax died at the scene from catastrophic crushing injuries to the rib cage, lungs, and lower spine. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage, witness recordings, and the shuttle's onboard data, and the driver was cleared after it was determined the crowd had unexpectedly entered an active vehicle lane. If you ever end up in a situation like that, slow down, look around, and follow airport staff instead of just following scared people running in different directions.